All right, so we're going to take a look at the experiment now in practice, or how we might design this. So again, the key here is that we manipulate those independent variables to create different groups. So in the post-test only design, that's the one we're going to start with. That's the simplest design for an experiment. And let's take a look at what that might entail. All right, so you have a whole bunch of participants, and you want to know, does watching violent TV cause aggressive behavior? So the first thing is that watching violent TV is your independent variable, right? We're wondering, does this cause aggressive behavior? So the cause is the independent variable. So now we're going to manipulate the independent variable to create separate groups. So we take our participants, we take our 100 subjects, and we're going to manipulate the independent variable to split them into an experimental group and to split them into a control group. We're going to use randomization in order to do that. So typically, as soon as they show up at the door, we would either generate them a random number, for example, using Excel, and if it came out even, they would go into the experimental group. If it came out odd, they would go into the control group, and that would randomize them across the different groups. One experimental group, one control group. This is where we manipulate the independent variable. And then what we would do is we would measure them on their dependent variable. We would measure them on the aggressive behavior. So that splitting up of them in between the two groups, that is where you manipulate the independent variable, the cause. And then when you measure their behavior, that's where you manipulate the dependent variable, the outcome, the effect. All right, so in our example here, we had our participants, we have our young children showing up to our lab. And remember that the key here is not the behavior that they did before. So one thing you would not do is ask these children, what kind of TV do you watch? Oh, how many hours of, these types of shows do you watch? Oh, you watch, 4 hours of violent TV. Oh, you watch 8 hours of violent TV. That's not experimental, because that is up to them. That's up to their outside factors. That's up to their other characteristics. That's not an experiment. An experiment is where we manipulate how much TV they watch, how much violent TV they watch. So through randomization, half of these subjects would be put into the experimental group, where we would make them watch 1 hour of Attack on Titan. And we would make them watch 1 hour of this violent TV show. And then the other half would get sent to the control group, and we would make them watch 1 hour of Julie Andrews' The Green Room, right? So a non-violent TV show. And that is what we manipulate, and it's independent, right? So independent variable gets its name from the fact that it is independent of their behaviors. So if this subject over here said, oh, I heard you guys are showing Attack on Titan, can I be in that group? You would say, it's independent of your behavior. Let me flip my coin. Let me check my random number generator. Nope, you're going to be watching Julie Andrews' Green Room. So it's independent of what they do, and we manipulate it. So we make them watch 1 hour of violent TV, and the other group watches 1 hour of non-violent TV. And then what we do is we measure them on their violent behavior, and we see if there's any difference between those two. And if there is a difference here in the dependent variable, it could only come from this difference here. Because through randomization, the groups are equal. We didn't care about the baggage that they brought to the table. And through randomization, we made sure that that baggage was equally dispersed. So the only difference here can be, the only source of a difference here is the difference here. And that's why we can logically conclude that this difference in watching violent TV caused any differences that we might see in the dependent variable. Does that make sense? So far, so good? All right. So we compare them on the dependent variable. I kind of jumped ahead of myself there, but we compare them on the dependent variable. So after splitting them up into groups, we would then measure their violent behavior. And if you recall previously, we would still use some of those techniques from non-experimental methods like delimiting. And we might say, all right, now everybody has half an hour to go play, and we're just going to count how many times somebody hits somebody else. So we compare those two, and again, any difference here can only come from the difference in what they watched before, because the two groups were randomized so that they're the same. So if they lead to different behaviors, the only difference between the two groups was the TV that they were exposed to. And that's the essence of an experiment. All right, so in research, and this is where the big challenge in research comes, you want to keep all your other variables constant. You want to make sure that the only difference between your two groups is the variable of interest. So we want to make sure that the only difference between our two groups is the amount of violence in their TV program. So once again, we do this through direct experimental control to make sure that the groups are the same, randomization to make sure that the groups are the same. And that is what occurred here, because again, these 50 subjects were basically the same as these 50 subjects over here. So we can't explain this difference with anything else than the difference in violence. On the other hand, if we didn't randomize, and we just said, all right, all the female subjects are going to go here, and all the male subjects are going to go here, then we found a difference. That's known as a confound. That gives you an alternate explanation. It could be that any difference we found here is due to the violent TV, or any difference we found here is due to the difference between female subjects and male subjects. That's a second possibility. So we've opened ourselves up to secondary alternative explanations. We have a confound. And that's again why we want to randomize, so that these two groups are the same, and any difference there can only come from a difference in the violence on TV. All right, so that was the post-test only design. Now we're going to take a look at another one, another kind of simple design, which is the pretest post-test design. So in the pretest post-test design, what you do is you basically take the post-test design and you add yourself a pretest where you measure the groups on the dependent variable before you manipulate your independent variable, and then you measure the outcome of that independent variable. So in this situation here, doing the same experiment, looking at violence on TV, what we would do is, once again, we would randomize these two groups, and then before exposing them to the independent variable, to the differences in TV, and before measuring their outcome on the dependent variable, we would give them a pretest. And the pretest would be there. One of the reasons to have it is just to make sure that the randomization worked, just to make sure that these two groups are actually equal on their level of aggression. And that gives us more confidence that, yes, this is the only factor that could have caused any difference that we see later. So that's a pretest post-test design. And again, just adding that pretest as sort of a double check to make sure that your randomization actually worked, actually took place. And something like this would be an important factor to consider if, for example, your subject numbers were low. So randomization might not be effective enough to make sure that the groups are equal. All right, so those are the two basic designs. And remember, we want to keep all our variables constant through those direct experimental controls or randomization. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do a little critical thinking exercise, and we're going to take a look at our experiment here. And what I want to know is what other variables in this description were not kept constant that could be an alternative explanation. And basically, what are those confounding variables. So let's take a look at this post-test only design right here. So once again, we take the subjects, randomly split them up, have them watch Attack on Titan for 1 hour, violent TV show, have them watch Julie Andrews' The Green Room, non-violent TV show, and then we measure their difference in violence afterwards. Say we find a difference here, we want to say that it's due to violence versus non-violence, but we have left ourselves open because we have at least a couple of confounding variables here. So let's give it a shot. What is an alternative explanation? So if this group was found to be more violent than this group, what other than the difference in violence on those TV shows could have been a contributing factor? Yep.
If there's like one especially violent kid in the play to that group, and then when they went to go play for half an hour afterwards, his actions influenced the other kids around him to be more like aggressive.
Okay, so that's definitely a possibility. We, for this, and you do want to be aware of that. For this exercise, though, we're going to assume that the randomization worked. And what occurs with those is that reason is one of the reasons why psychologists always want more subjects. So you'll never hear a psychologist basically saying, "Oh, I got 200 subjects. It's too much." Right? They always want more because there's always a possibility that you get that one extreme individual. If you compare that one extreme individual to 5 other individuals, they make a big difference in the overall measure of behavior. If you compare that one individual to 500 other individuals, they get washed out in a sea of normal people, I guess would be one way to put it. So yeah, that's definitely something to consider. But let's assume that the randomization worked properly and both of those groups are exactly the same. What is the difference between those two shows? What was that? This one's nice? That one's not? Okay, can you elaborate on what you mean by nice? Okay, so one of them doesn't have violence, one of them does. That's exactly what we want because we're asking, does violence cause aggressive behavior? Are there any other differences? Yep. One's animated and one's real people, right? That's a possible confounding factor. So it might be that it's the actual animated nature of this and the live action nature of this that is causing less violence here and more violence here. So there are theories of identification. There are theories of cartooning that basically say one of the reasons why people like animation, like cartoons, is because it's easier to identify with the characters. So I'll give you an example. Let's say I was drawing a picture of one of you, all right? All right, who did I draw? You have no idea because this could be any one of you, right? At this level of cartooning, this represents everyone in this classroom. As soon as I add more details, though, some of you are now disqualified, right? This is definitely not some of you. So when you have not as much detail, it's easier for people to identify with the characters. It's easier for people to get involved in the story. And that's one of the reasons, especially children, really like animation. So it could be that this was animated and this was not. So animation leads to violence. Live action leads to not violence. That's a possible explanation. What would we want to do to get rid of that explanation? Mm-hmm. Exactly. So we would want to get rid of that difference here so that the only difference is violence and either make this a live action show, choose something like CSI, type show, or make this an animated show. to something like, I don't know, Trolls, the beat goes on or something, right, for that one. So make them both animated. So that's one possible confounding variable. One is animated, one is not. What's another possibility? Anything else come to mind? It's difficult. It isn't easy. Doing an experiment sometimes and finding these differences. Yep. But yeah, was that a hand
Yeah,
going up
I
or?
was gonna say, what if there's like a show that had like an episode that was kind of violent, but then like an episode that was like kind of soft, so you showed them the same show.
Okay, that would be one way of taking into account a lot of the other variables that were possibilities. Do you have an idea?
I'm not familiar with the show.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's one educational, one not.
Okay, so that's a possibility, right? So I'm not very familiar with this show, but I have watched the first season of this show, and I gave up on it after what, like a 5-year hiatus between season 1 and season 2. It was like taking forever. Anyways, it could be that this show is educational and this show is not. So maybe watching an educational piece puts people back into the mindset of being in school, where you're not going to be violent. Maybe watching a non-educational TV show is going to make you violent. So maybe it's the level of education in the TV show. Maybe it has to do with the fact that this one has puppets, right? This one does not. Maybe that's the reason why this led to violence, this led to non-violence. Maybe just actually kind of looking at this, it has to do with the fact that this features a diverse group of individuals. This show features all Germans, right? So this is one of those weird animes where just about everybody in this show is German. And in fact, if anybody's seen it, there's a plot point about the fact that there's a few Asian people left in this society. Maybe that has to do with it. Diversity leads to non-violence. Non-diversity leads to violence. This is high action. This is not. Maybe high action leads to violence. Low action leads to non-violence. So all of these are potential alternative explanations, right? All of these are potential confounds where instead of being able to say violence causes aggressive behavior, non-violence causes non-aggressive behavior, now we have maybe violence or animation or high action or lack of diversity causes violence, and then the other ones cause non-violence. So that's one of the kind of things to consider when you're designing an experiment. And yours is actually a great suggestion about what to do with this, because you would want to choose conditions here. You would want to manipulate it where it's as similar as possible, and the only difference would be violence versus non-violence. And that was the first time anybody suggested taking 2 episodes from the same TV show, because they're both going to be animated. They're both going to have the same, or they're not going to be animated, right? They're both going to star Julie Andrews. I don't know if she goes off the rails on one of these episodes or anything like that, but that would be a great way to say, all right, highly violent episode, non-highly violent episode, everything else would be the same, give you a much more clear ability to make that final comparison. What was that?
Like an older cartoon or like an older show, because I feel like those very.
Yeah. And you can also, I was thinking more about, I know in anime, there always seems to be that one episode where they go to the beach or they go to the spa, right? And it's like that fan service episode. And there's always nothing really violent happening in that, regardless of what's going on. So, but yeah, I mean, in a lot of TV shows, there's always that one episode that kind of sticks out because it was like uber violent. And then there's the other ones where they kind of mellow it down. And that's just, you know, the kind of narrative arc that a lot of these shows have. I mean, I've never seen Game of Thrones, but I've heard of the Red Wedding, and I would imagine that's probably like the bloodiest of the most violent of that series. Whereas I'm sure at one point people were watching the show and going, "This one's kind of mellow. This is more of a like, you know, let's get to know the characters thing. So yeah, so that would be a great way to kind of control all those other variables, because that's what you want to do. If you can get rid, or the more variables you can get rid of, the cleaner that deduction, that only difference is violence, so that causes any difference we see here. All right, any questions about or comments about the basic idea of experimental design and the need for manipulation of the independent variable to infer that causality? All right.